Morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it might be to you, thanks so much for having me. We're going to talk a little bit about the ethics, sources of ethical concern, take a look at where these harms might appear across the Gen AI life cycle. I want to make sure, flagging now, we're going to do a lot of exercises together, lots of thinking. There's a lot of us in the room, so it might be a little hard to unmute, which maybe saves some of you from me calling on you specifically. But I really hope that you have somewhere to take notes for our exercises, pen, paper, or typing, and we will be using the chat relatively actively. So I'll be looking for you all out there. I hope that your brains are on, that you're ready to go. If you need to get up, shake it out, whatever it is, before we get moving, please feel free to do so. I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting and then we'll get started. So, a little bit about generative AI ethics. I think the promise and allure of generative AI is often in its claim to like remove friction, right? Make your life easier. And it really, the thing that it shifts, I think, compared to like Google, for instance, is that it puts the responsibility or the onus on the machine, the model, to figure out what it is that you want, right? Rather than us as users having to communicate in a way that's easily understandable to the machine. But in such a kind of frictionless environment, I think Olivia spoke really compellingly about this, that to use generative AI ethically, right, to use it responsibly, we have to actively choose to introduce friction around the work, that it can't just be as simple as putting a prompt in and taking whatever the prompt says for granted. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to think a little bit more about where tools themselves introduce friction and where we might want to actively introduce friction in order to make sure that we're using them responsibly. Right. So it's important to be cognizant of this as we develop collective, individual, critical thinking. Just two quick caveats and T&Cs, terms and conditions for me. I'm not a WASH specialist. I want to extend my gratitude to Nicole, all her help in providing context and detail. I want to thank you all also for filling out the forms to provide context about your work. But obviously, I'm happy to answer any broader questions related to, like, for instance, the humanitarian sector. Largely, which I have more experience with. Secondly, you'll often see me trying to speak specifically about generative AI because it's distinct from non-generative AI and is a category of AI, which is a very big category overall. So it's important for us to be purposeful, particular about language, and where possible, to try to think about what it is that we're attempting to get generative AI to do, rather than just talking about it as though it's this amorphous catch-all thing. And that's really helpful as we start to think about risks and ethics. Um, just a little bit about Maltech Initiative, in case you're not too familiar, which is totally fair. We're an organization that looks at the ethical use of AI primarily in monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning. We're interested in the MEL on the impact of AI. So, how do we evaluate AI, and how do we also obviously use AI within that responsibly? We do a lot of capacity strengthening, community building as well within our community practice, and we try to influence the sector to take up learnings to do better work. But generally, I think our work is pretty broad. So we've done a lot of work that might be useful to yourselves. I can share some later reports on what the implications of AI are for democracy, for research on tech facilitated gender-based violence, and so forth. So just to give you a little situation on where I come from. All right, so AI ethics. Humanitarians have a very clear set of overarching obligations already, right? The principles, humanitarian principles, provide a way of working, sense checking, and working practices that help to situate how you all operate. Principles like do no harm, the preservation of human dignity, preservation of humanity, all of these are really important, right? And just because the tools we use change doesn't mean that those values necessarily have to. But what we do need to ask, right, is how they're changed with the introduction of generative AI, how they're challenged by the introduction of generative AI. So one of the core kind of things about AI ethics is to figure out what is new and what isn't with the use of generative AI and how these kind of core principles translate. There are three different pieces of the puzzle here to think about. The first is design, right? So AI tools are built on top of foundation models, like that's the large language model LLM that forms the bedrock of generative AI tools. And how those tools are built really matters, right? The data that goes in at that point is really integral to the kind of information that comes out. But also a substantial bias can be introduced, right? Bias in, bias out, garbage in, garbage out might all have been kind of phrases that you're familiar with. So we need to question the people, the spaces, the places that we have more and less information on, right? Where do we have data scarcity? What kind of data we have? These models are often fiercely guarded in the closed ecosystem. As Olivia discussed, it's also the part where us as external individuals often have the least insight into. But this is a really important part of where ethics obviously is applied. Deployment, how people, organizations are using these tools, that's where you and your organization appear, right? It's about how you decide to use these tools within your workflows. And that's one I think we'll focus a little bit more on as we move through this. The third category we increasingly have to think about is this like idea of macro context, right? The wider context in which AI is being designed and deployed. That includes the big tech companies themselves, right? The geopolitical context, like around data sovereignty and increasingly model sovereignty. Regulations like the EU AI Act and so forth. And it means thinking about how other uses of generative AI might relate to your use because they're the same system, right? So the behavior of big tech CEOs or the advancement of anti-human rhetoric, right? The use of generative AI in ways that are counter to the work of humanitarians in warfare, in hostile immigration policies, and the monitoring, surveillance, targeting of protesters, right? All of those things are counter to the humanitarian operation and mission. And so it's this kind of enmeshment, right, of positive and negative uses, the impossibility of separating them out, that can become really important as we consider these like larger scale questions of ethics. So that's a little preview about where we want to think about ethics and how we can start to split up the different places and different sources of ethical concern. I want to do a quick poll, which hopefully should be in the Zoom. The question is, which risk and harm of generative AI are you most concerned about, or are you concerned about? You can pick all of them that apply. So if all of them are concerning to you, you've thought about all of them, please feel free to pick all of them. We're going to give maybe 10, 20 seconds for folks to pick that. I'm going to say that I am concerned by all of them because I am, but I'll minus one for the numbers. Okay, so we've got a lot of coverage here: data privacy, misinformation, deepfakes, model algorithm bias, and environmental harm. Automated decision making is kind of all the top, and then a little bit lower down, cybersecurity threats and job loss. And I think I have what looks like some kind of summary answer. So that might be useful for you if you're thinking about it. And that's really useful for us to collectively understand as we consider the different types of ethical concepts. So I know someone asked earlier about potential different sources, and I pulled some out here for you. We're going to zoom in on a couple. There are many, many, many ethical concerns, and often they are layered on top of each other. They press upon each other, right? And the difficulty with generative AI is that some of these concerns are shared among different uses, and others may appear or be more acute with specific uses. They often also follow existing lines of marginalization, of historical oppression, like colonization, right? So, for instance, environmental impacts, which are already unevenly felt, the exacerbation of the environmental crisis, the pressure on natural resources of generative AI, is most likely to be felt in the same countries where data labeling and cheap data labor is being outsourced to, right? Companies where labor rights are poor, big tech companies are facilitating intermediaries who can take advantage of limited enforcement. And so you get this kind of layering and multiplying of ethical concerns. So we're going to take a closer look at four of them. Two have been very conveniently covered to some detail by Olivier, so we'll talk a little bit faster in some of those. So environmental impacts. I think this is the one that maybe folks was pretty high up on the list just now. There's enormous environmental impacts of training. There's ongoing fine tuning, responding to queries. All of this creates enormous pressure, huge pressure on the environment, right? So one part of that is energy. Data centers require a lot of energy. You might already be familiar with this. Globally, the electricity consumption of data centers in 2022 would have made it the equivalent to the 11th largest country in terms of use of electricity. The projection is, if you're wondering about the numbers, it's 460 terawatt hours. The projection is that by 2026, the electricity consumption data centers combined would be equivalent to about 1,000 terawatt hours. So that's a twofold increase, and that would make it equivalent to the fifth largest consumer of energy if it were a country. So it's a huge load. There are so many countries that are using less and have less access to a power grid capacity. big providers, right, like Meta, Amazon, so forth, have seen their energy usage more than double since they started building out their tools. Water, which I think for wash specialists is probably very important, um, is another big concern. It's used for cooling systems in particular. And as those systems have gotten more efficient, both on the energy and also cooling front, I think overall the growing use of AI is likely to counter a lot of that, right? So even the gains that we do have are not enough to offset. In during the GPT-4's training period in Iowa, which is where Microsoft data centers that were used to help train GPT-4, around 11.5 million gallons of water were used. So that's 6% of all the usage in the district. And that happened in time where there's a severe drought. So there are lots of impacts and consequences for people both in the immediate vicinity of data centers and more broadly for us collectively in a time of water scarcity and obviously a growing environmental crisis. Second thing, we can talk about data privacy. Again, also a little bit covered, so we'll go a bit more faster through this. The design and creation of LLMs requires extensive data collection that poses a risk to digital privacy, right? A lot of the data that was fed into models was collected and used without consent. That includes personal data within this data harvesting, which raises privacy concerns. But there's also no way to completely ensure that your inputted data currently is not used for other purposes, even if you have an account with an enterprise model. So that raises clear concerns and questions around consent when using sensitive data, which a lot of WASH organizations and practitioners may be handling. But it also is sometimes difficult to know exactly what is and isn't sensitive, and the kind of compute power that allows generative AI to do the things that we like also enables it to do a lot of the kind of cross-referencing, pseudonym breaking, and so on that can undermine privacy. So even if you don't put in personally identifying information, you might be able to generate demographically identifying information. Bias, I think this is a big question for everybody. Bias can occur across the life cycle in model development, data collection, data labeling, model training, and deployment. And it can be very difficult to discern this bias. And if it's reflective of our own bias, right, we might be blinkered to it. But equally, I think that given that a lot of this, there's a lot of unrepresented data sets that are fed into training models, it limits the applicability of these systems outside of those kind of dominant contexts. So where we have a lot of data on these systems might work better, but where we have less data on, which often is also where humanitarians are operating or trying to understand more information around, you have a less accurate picture, less precise picture of what's going on in those places. And so have to query what the utility might be as a result of that. And lastly, accountability. So I think the one thing that humanitarians and all users of generative AI, but certainly those who are serving people on the front lines need to be asking is when there is a result or a mistake or an oversight as a result of the use of generative AI, right, that can result in things like loss of service access or overlooking a particular site that is in need but wasn't sufficiently represented in the data. What is the consequence of relying on these tools and who is responsible, right? It's very difficult to audit these tools. It's sometimes referred to as the black box of models. So it's possible also that models give accurate outputs that we don't understand, but know they're accurate. And so that makes it really difficult, especially in cutting edge use cases, to be able to explain to people how decisions are being made and when decisions are going wrong, to know where they're going wrong and who's responsible for them. And humanitarians need to certainly think a little bit more about what those lines of accountability look like. And that becomes a lot harder when the ground truth itself is lost, right? As we use models upon models upon models, and AI workflows, generative AI workflows on top of each other can be much increasingly difficult to figure out where the initial source of truth lies. So I'm sure that you were listening very closely to all of that just now. We're going to do an exercise to try to relate ethical concerns with usage. So this is a slide with three different possible uses and some more specific examples of what that might look like. It is drawn from your own responses to, I think, previous pre the call, some answers that you gave. So what I want you to do is pick one of these and to, based on the ethical concerns that I discussed earlier, but also things that you're thinking about, write down what you think the ethical concerns related to one of these uses might be. You can use the specific examples that are given on the right hand side if they're relevant to you. If they're not, that's okay. You can focus on the left and the kind of higher level usage. So we're going to have maybe a minute or so for that, and then we're going to go again with another one. So the task is to pick one of these rows, summarization, classification, extraction, and to think about what ethical concerns might arise. Here's the second slide. Translation, conversation, or forecasting. And again, pick one of these examples, either translation, conversation, or forecasting, and write down what ethical concerns you think are associated with the potential use of this. And as you're wrapping up, I'd love if you could add one of the examples from either this previous slide or this slide into the chat. Okay, so Nicole's put translation and ethical concerns bias. Uh, Sol's put translation ethical concern of accountability. Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to keep moving. I just want to remind you that if you want to do some additional work on this yourself, that what we're trying to do is think about the uses and the ethical concerns that are associated with them that you would identify as associated with them. Okay, so who bears the harms then? Because I think one piece of the puzzle is what the harm actually is, what the concern is, but the other piece of the puzzle is who is at risk, right? Who are we putting in harm's way when we look at when we think about using generative AI tools? So for those of you who use summarization as the thing that you focus on, I put some down here about what different ethical concerns at the bottom, what different ethical concerns could be related. It's not exhaustive, just indicative. Um, and so we need to think about who might be harmed by reliability issues, who might be harmed by false information, who might be harmed by bias, right? How does summarization, if we make a decision based on incorrectly summarized information, who is accountable for that? But thinking about the who of the harm is also really important in the context of ethical use. Are there populations or groups or individuals who are repeatedly being exposed to harm? So when we look at this, for instance, bias is, I think, across the board, we're most likely to see that nearly all of these things will affect individuals that you are working to help assist. Some of them might affect you individually, your reputation, your standing, potentially organizational trust if the decision's significant enough is made. But presumably, all of these involve having an impact that will hurt service users, beneficiaries, impacted communities. So I want you to look at your example that you gave just now, look at the risks that you highlighted and ask yourself who bears the burden of those risks, right? How might different groups be impacted by the risk? So, for instance, I think we had Ayobamidele put summarization, and there could be environmental risks, right? So, who is most affected by environmental impacts of the use of generative AI? Right? Or so you'd put extraction and copyright, who might be most affected by that. So I want you to write down next to wherever you chose to write this down initially in your notepad or whatever, who you think is most harmed by this. And ask yourself too, where the level of power they have in the decision making, the ability they have to influence the decision making, or not, right? So now we're going to think a little bit more about what ethical use means. We talked a lot about ethical considerations, potential harms, who bears the brunt of those harms. Often I think people are looking for a straightforward answer to the question of AI ethics, right? Like what model is most ethical, what prompt is most ethical. But I think it's much more complicated than that in reality, as we heard earlier from Olivia. And for now, ethical use might involve changing the model that you use or being more intentional. but often it's insufficient to feel like your use is fully ethical because of the many, many different kinds of concerns, risks, and considerations that you have to make. So ideally, I think a little bit more about responsible use, right? If we think that it's really difficult to find a singular ethical way to do things, how can we make sure that we're always practicing being responsible? So in this next part, we'll talk a little bit more about trying to get close to the ethical through responsible use. So we have two quick polls in the interest of time. Okay, yeah, we go, they're coming together. Perfect. So the first question is, does your organization have a Gen AI use policy? Yes or no, or you're not sure? And do you have a personal use policy? Um, Sometimes our organizations don't have a policy, or they don't cover the particular uses that you want to have, so you might be more advanced. So do you know where your own red lines are? And do you have clear lines, clear limitations or boundaries around your usage? So just does your organization have a policy and do you have a personal policy? Okay, so um, we're seeing around half of people have an organizational policy. A third do not, and then 18% is saying they're not sure. And then a personal use policy, most people have not yet thought about a personal use policy. It doesn't have to be written down, but just a sense of where your own lines are. So that's really useful to know as we head into the next section. So it's not easy to be ethical, I think is the bottom line, right? It's not easy to do the right thing. I think everybody here, based on your questions and your engagement and attendance, really wants to think about making a responsible choice regarding the different ways that you might want to use generative AI. But making ethical choices also requires an enabling environment, right? One that can help you make consistently thoughtful, purposeful choices. So I put together a big long list, which we don't have time to go through, but just wanted to indicate all the different things that facilitate ethical use, right? Technically, the conditions itself, right? The tools, the time, the training, and so forth, and the ability to have clear purpose, right? Organizational policies, personal sense of how to use it, and so on. It's not a checklist, but it's more an indication of what you might want to be thinking about. I think there's also on oh no, there isn't a French one, sorry. But you want to think about what kind of policies might be needed to capture the complicated reality of use, right? What might you need to do before you can meet your own organizational goals regarding ethical use? So we're going to look at this WASH workflow. And I want you to look at on the left-hand side, we have different stages: project design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and then coordination and knowledge management. So I want you to identify a stage where pain points might arise for you. So maybe you have a lot of challenges, you're spending a lot of time around monitoring and evaluation, or it might be most relevant to your job, right? You might be doing a lot of coordination, knowledge management. Identify a stage and identify a task that you have used generative AI to do or are thinking about using generative AI to do. So on the right-hand side are a bunch of different examples of tasks. So for project design, it says, for instance, drafting bills of quantities or structuring terms of reference. You can use some different example if you are already using generative AI to do something different. So write it down. Write down what stage and what task you might want to use generative AI to do, or you have already used generative AI to do. So I'm going to give you a second to look at that. I apologize that there isn't a French translation. That's on me. I did not get this to Nicole and so on time. So project design, implementation, monitor evaluation, coordination, and knowledge management. Write it down. You can put it in the chat if you want, or you can write it down on a piece of paper and write down what a task that you might use it to do. And then together we're going to do one final activity before I wrap up. Okay, amazing. Thank you for those who are sharing. It's really nice to see, really interesting to see what you might want to use it for or have already used it for. Okay, so now here is a massive list of questions. And these are questions that we put together that we use to help people think about whether or not they have an ethical use case, right? Here are all the different considerations and questions you might want to ask yourself before you decide to deploy or usage of generative AI in that capacity, right? So there's a benefits assessment, there's a risk assessment, and a reliability assessment. I want you to skim these quickly and see how many of these can you answer yes to. So based on the stage, the task, think about that and ask yourself, can you answer yes to this question? So for instance, would its use significantly improve the experience of stakeholders? And how will you measure this? Can you answer yes to this question? Do you have measures? Do you know or have a sense of whether or not it would significantly improve the experience of stakeholders? So look through these questions. You can skim quickly. I know there's a lot of questions. Start to ask yourself and get a sense. Do you have a yes or no answer? Do you have a maybe? Do you have a don't know? Because ultimately, I think, especially given the discussion that we had earlier, what this exercise shows is the different factors that can impact a decision to use generative AI, right? At the beginning, we talked about ethical use and purposely reintroducing friction into this supposedly frictionless encounter. And asking ourselves these questions starts to reintroduce that friction again, right? Turns our brains back on, as Olivia was saying earlier. But what it also demonstrates is that in many ways, this kind of frictionless quality of generative AI might be an illusion at times, right? Friction might be moved around the system to other tasks, like having to ask all of these questions of yourself, to other people potentially who might have to develop more policies, more tools, do more vetting or more review. Um, and to obviously addressing the new concerns that arise, for instance, about understanding model fine tuning, comparing different models, right? These are all like new tasks that create friction that are necessary for both useful AI use and also ethical AI use. So mostly, I'm looking in the chat, amazing. So some folks are saying mostly no, some others are saying yes, seem more confident. Um, I can't quite read, Olivia, your picture, unfortunately. Some other no's, half. So there's a bit of discrepancy around how confident folks are, how much knowledge they have, how much ability they have to answer these questions. And what I encourage you to do as you move forward is to think about the importance of being able to see past these like big shiny promises, right? And develop the ability to discern when it actually brings benefits, which maybe after all of this work you have to do to figure out if it's ethical or not, those benefits might not be worth all the extra time, right? The benefits might not be worth the time that's required to make sure that your output is reliable or make sure that it's been properly checked for bias. And when it might introduce harms or may only just add extra work for yourself or for others and potentially extra risk for those that you are working to support. Just the last note then, because I know I'm very close to time. I'm so sorry, Nicole. We have a lot of these conversations over at Meltech Initiative. We'd love to have you if you're interested. We have a community of practice. It's a plug because it's free. It's free resources with mailing lists. It's a free Slack community, working groups, events, very responsive to what people's questions are and interests are. So if that is of use to you, I just wanted to share that here. And then I can add the link to the chat as well. But I thank you so much all for listening. I know that that was a lot, and hopefully we can follow up on some of these threads. I think I added my email at the beginning, but I'll add it again. If you have extra questions, we can always chat.